We're turning you now to the main story of the day, those shutdown protests that we're seeing in various parts of South Africa. Let's talk about what's been happening today with Asanda Ngoasheng, a political analyst. Asanda, you've been watching the movement of the members of COSATU as well as SAFTU. What do you make of how well it's gone and the message they've been able to send to government and business?
It doesn't look like it's as successful as they necessarily thought. So in terms of the numbers, they're not as big as they expected, but also not as big as South African marches of this magnitude are usually. And I think part of it is because buses as well as the taxi associations decided to continue working. So usually a national shutdown works usually when buses and taxis and all other transport systems also join, which means that even those who aren't necessarily interested in joining would have no choice or option if they use public transport, because they wouldn't have a way to get to work. And so I think the lack of participation by the taxi associations and the bus driving industry has led to lower numbers, but I think it's still a good turning or a good show up. And if you consider that, already during lockdown, there were calls or cries about the high electricity prices. I was personally involved in research that looked at, how the prices are affecting people, and people were saying they've done away with luxuries. Some were saying it's so bad that they now don't eat vegetables. They've removed vegetables, they've removed meat from their meals, and so they're eating just purely starch because they can't afford electricity. And then you also have besides electricity, you've got high rising cost of food, and we know there have been various releases by various organizations of about the hunger crisis in South Africa at the moment, and the fact that because we lost 2 million plus jobs during COVID-19, the economy hasn't had the opportunity to recover. And a lot of people who were already in dire situation are living in an even worse situation, because those who maybe had one breadwinner are now sitting with no one working. And as we can see, the economy just keeps getting worse, precisely because of, post-COVID, it's a global thing that's happening. So it's a global economic crisis that doesn't seem to want to abate in its way. The Russia crisis is not helping with oil and gas prices. And so it's really just dire. So I'm not surprised that, people are coming out in the streets and are trying to tell the government that they are no longer able to afford anything, before we even start talking about petrol, which has just been seen a phenomenal increase, which has led to even middle-class people struggling to be able to make ends meet.
Asanda, you've worked in academia, you've also been in the media space when COSATU used to lead massive demonstrations at a time, right? Yesterday, there are various other factors affecting turnout, and there are, we must say, significant numbers on the streets in other parts of South Africa today. Are unions still as powerful as they were in terms of their ability to mobilize South Africans behind a cause?
I think that unions have over the past kind of 5 years, we've seen a decline in terms of the ability to bring people to the street. But I think it's not just that unions are waning, it's also that I think people are tired of taking to the streets each time they are unhappy about something, because they've seen that it doesn't bring the necessary results. And so I think people are looking at alternative systems and ways to engage government, and alternative system and ways to make their voices heard. I think there's also a general helplessness and just exhaustion in South Africa between COVID-19, the corruption, and everything else that has happened. People are also scared to lose the jobs that they do have, because they've seen their own communities decimated by unemployment. And so people who ordinarily would be happy to join a strike are not likely to join one, because they don't want to take the risk of losing their job, or even if they don't lose their job, they don't want to take the risk of not getting paid for this one day, because in this economy, you need every single cent.
And the counter, or the other side of that coin then, is that business, corporate, then uses the desperation of people in this scenario to pay the lowest possible wage, knowing very well that Asanda may have no other option at employment.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is something that government should and should have, been looking at and has always ignored. The fact that, South Africa doesn't have enough employment or labor supervisors or labor monitors has led to a situation where people's labor rights are constantly being thrashed about and not kind of respected in any way. We've seen, for example, high levels of casualization across different industries and sectors where people can work, for 5 years, for 10 years, even sometimes, on a 0-hour contract, meaning there is no formal employment. They only get paid when they rock up at work. And this has had an impact, of course, also on people's desire to kind of do anything that may lead to them losing their job, because losing your job has become easier and retaining a job has become more and more difficult. And the government is the one that's supposed to play the role of ensuring that employers do not abuse or take advantage of people, and that employers at the very least pay the minimum wage, have not been doing their job of monitoring. And we know the Minister of Labour has come out and very clearly said that there aren't enough labour monitors. But, nothing has been done to change that situation. There's a lot that could have been done to make sure that they hire more labor monitors so that all labor rights abuses are going to be monitored and that there are repercussions, because it's also not enough to just have monitors going and writing reports. There need to be real life repercussions for people who break labor laws. And it's just this combination of, circumstances that is making life more and more difficult for the working class, but also even for the middle class. And I think also, just to go back a little bit to your previous question, we saw that, with Zulinzi Mavavi leaving COSATU, that had a big impact, and the big fallout between COSATU, the leadership squabbles, and also the weakening relationship between COSATU and the African National Congress have all led to a labor movement that used to be strong and that used to have, a big sway and a big impact on people, being not as strong as it used to be and not as impactful. And I think, as I said, we must always consider that the hopelessness, the general hopelessness and depression, essentially, that people are feeling about the economy, about the country, about where things are going, also has a contributing factor, because you need to be not just fed up, but you also need to have the energy to want to do something about being fed up for you to rock up at a protest.
I'm glad you mentioned COSATU and the ANC, because that relationship has been somewhat of a contradiction as far as optics are concerned. People saying, well, in a year, you'll be saying, let's vote ANC, but today you're marching against the very ANC government, saying it's failed workers on the economic front, and that even the unemployed should come forward and march against that very organization, which in 12 months COSATU will be campaigning for.
Yeah, this is exactly part of the problem, that the tripartite alliance makes it very awkward for Labour to be credible or to have a credible voice. But I also want to add one other proviso, which is that ever since unions were able to get a share in companies and sit on the boards, we've seen less and less robust discussion. We've seen less and less accountability. We've seen less and less of a desire to really protect the interest of the working class, because they now have shares and they now have a vested interest in the capitalistic structure of industries that before they would be fighting purely for the workers. Now they sit at the same table as the owners of capital and are, basically part of wanting to make sure that the company continues and that the company makes a profit, because they stand to benefit. And I think there's lots that one can investigate around the impact of the fact that, unions now have shares in companies, on how it does or doesn't represent people, and also on their desire to, take more radical action that we saw in the past, or has this actually made them less risk averse? You'll know, if you remember Marikana, for example, there were accusations that one of the reasons why things went the way they went is because NUM was actually in bed with the mining industry and they were not doing the things that they were supposed to do, and that's why AMCU came about. And so we shouldn't be surprised as well if we start seeing more and more new unions forming and more civic organizations that are not linked to traditional structures for labor and for just general South African concerns to be raised.
Asanda Ngoasheng, good to speak to you as always. Thank you.